Hello, guys and girls. The program you are about to hear will be both fun and educational, but it is not a substitute for medical advice. Although we are doctors, we are not your doctors. Hello and welcome to Travel Medicine. As always, I'm your friendly neighborhood internal medicine doc, Dr. J.
Hey guys, straight from the lab. This is Dr. Santhosh, your pediatric infectious disease doctor and researcher.
And joining us, we have the cast of our wildly successful, as far as we know, space drama.
It was so... That was fantastic. Yes.
Let's meet each of our cast members, starting with who you are and what you actually do, and then we can get to your characters. So to begin with, thank you for joining us, Eleanor.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Eleanor Rangers. I'm the president of Space Medicine Associates. And I guess you can kind of blame me for the script because I was involved in writing primarily the script, adapting it actually from a simulation exercise that Space Medicine Associates had actually written about a decade ago, along with some of the other participants that are here on the call this evening. And it was presented at a couple of live events. And then in talking with Josh, he suggested that perhaps we adapt it for a podcast. So that's how this all came together. And I actually played the role of Sarah Harrington, the flight director.
Hi, it's Gary McQueen. I'm on the board of directors of the Canadian Space Society, and I'm also a member of the National Space Society, where I met Eleanor and the rest of the gang for that original live sim. I play Jeff Gould, the reporter in Mission Control.
Hello, I'm Lynn Messina. I am a production supervisor at McGraw-Hill, and I work on technical books, engineering, computer science, construction, all that kind of really fun stuff. And I played Nancy Cranklin in the podcast.
When we first met through sheer fortuitous chance that you had a couple of these simulations that you would run. Now, when you guys developed these, this was a joint venture, or was this just Space Medicine Associates? Did you work with anyone? And who made use of these simulations?
I had attended, along with Linda Plush, this must have been in the early 90s. We attended a conference in Houston on medicine and extreme environments, which is a very interesting meeting. So it talked about, high altitude medicine, space flight, deep sea diving, and so forth. And one of the afternoon activities was actually to participate in a simulation of a medical disaster. I think it was in the on the moon. And that original script was written by former members of Mission Control in Houston. Well, I was absolutely captivated by this. I thought it was great, and eventually I was able to obtain the script for that exercise. A couple of friends of mine, including Linda, actually ran that at a National Space Society meeting. Actually there was a fair amount of interest at that point, and I think, if memory serves me, that's when I met Gary and Tom, and there was some just kind of informal conversation at that point about, hey, it would be pretty cool to do this again, but, what about next year? And I also think the National Space Society expressed interest in it. So that's eventually what led to us putting together the current scenario, which was presented the following year at the National Space Society, and it was subsequently used in a couple of other venues, including Balticon, believe it or not, several years ago, and then most recently adapted into this podcast. So it evolved from actually observing another type of scenario, and I kind of thought it was really captivating. And what I enjoyed about it in the live scenario is that there's, I would say, a degree of nonlinearity to the outcome. Depending on the mix of people in the room, and their backgrounds, you can end up either killing the entire crew or getting them home. and it just depends on the mix and the interaction in the room. And the whole goal, obviously, is to have the team members work together, utilizing the data that they individually have to create a greater whole for the benefit of the crew. So that was kind of what lit my fire.
Nice.
Fantastic.
If I recall, Eleanor, I think I remember when we ran the simulation, I think it was in Denver in 2002, we had the participants who were members of the audience participate in one room while the team that we had on, quote, Mars was in another room. And we communicated via, I think it was VHS tapes.
Yes, we did.
Wow.
Yes, we did. And in fact, I think I still have the VHS tapes, believe it or not.
So this simulated the delay.
That's right.
It did.
We would build a 10-minute delay, and how it would work is we had a video camera that would record the Capcom in mission control, and then that would go over to the other room. Then they'd have to, queue up their VCR to hear the message, and then they would communicate back. So it did work into about a 10-minute delay or so between the rooms.
Nice.
They didn't want to just email, maybe? Send a Snapchat?
I
think we did that too. I remember there was a scenario where the video cut out and we switched to using a text chat.
Ground control to Major Tom.
I was actually a major at one point, so that was a good time. I almost refused the promotion, so I was to make me not Major Tom anymore. But no, that wasn't worth it. My name is Tom Hill, and I'm an aerospace engineer. I'm one of those lucky people who, when they were young, said, I want to be an aerospace engineer. I went to college as one and worked in the Air Force as one, and now I work in the civil world as one as well. Been in the industry for about, going on 25, 26 years. Worked with a lot of different things, not any manned space flight. It's been exclusively uncrewed satellites as far as like weather satellites or land survey satellites, things along those lines. So I've been in control rooms when something needs to go right and everybody's staring at one monitor waiting for a bit to flip saying that something happened. I got into writing after we lost Columbia. I was trying to think what we'd do now. What would we do? What's now? So I wrote a book called Space What Now, literally asking the question.
And then, Linda, who are you in the real world? What do you do? And who were you in the show?
In the real world, I'm a nurse practitioner. However, for the last, 20 years, I've been an aerospace consultant for NASA at JSC in human factors. And background is family practice and nephrology. And interestingly enough, nephrology, because the patients are dependent upon equipment, lends itself to space because I'm very used to having people totally dependent on machines. So kind of led me there in a weird kind of way.
And who were you in the show?
Pat.
All right, so now, folks, you've met our full crew. So, Gary, Tom, and Eleanor, when you first did this simulation, how different an experience, aside from communicating via VCR, which, by the way, kids, that's what we had before Blu-ray and DVDs, but after televisions.
And in some ways, it was much more flexible.
Create your own Netflix.
Kind of. We had a group in one room, and we had the other group in the other room. So they didn't see each other. It was a lot of fun, actually.
And how similar do you feel it was, having done the simulation as yourselves? What did it feel like to be running a version of this simulation in our story?
It was different with the story playing itself out. The way we wrote the script, we actually handed volunteers technical guides of how to respond. There were response plans and things like that, and we were hoping that they would open them up, and there were literally flow charts that if you had this problem, you should do this, and that's what kept it kind of open ended. In fact, I think the people at Balticon didn't realize they were stepping into a simulation. They thought they were just going to a talk, and but they were good sports about it, and I think everybody had fun.
I can imagine walking in like, wait, I'm part of what kind of situation now?
Yes, you're now mission control. You're in charge of life support. But I thought it was just that. Anyway.
But I just came here to get my CME credit.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the things we covered in our drama and in the sim. Starting with, first off, my virtual hat off to you, Santhosh, for my favorite character of the entire series, Helmet.
Aww.
But let's talk about what happened to Helmet and being exposed to hydrazine. You know, how realistic is this? Is this a problem that's happened on previous space missions? Have any of you had the opportunity to hear about this, interact with it? Did we do an accurate job?
I was actually just reading recently the Apollo astronauts from Apollo-Soyuz were exposed to hydrazine on their return to Earth. Somebody left a valve open. There are short-term and then longer-term problems with being exposed to hydrazine. Nitrogen tetroxide and monomethyl and hydrazine, they're usually used together, and they're very nasty chemicals. The problem is they're very great rocket fuels. So you could be exposed to either one.
Who would have thought that volatile combustible chemicals are both great at propelling giant masses into the sky and incredibly dangerous?
Santhosh, you know how the saying goes, you want to get into space, you got to have a few seizures.
There we go. Vance Brand briefly lost consciousness. Stafford retrieved emergency oxygen masks and put one on Brand and gave one to Slayton. They were hospitalized for 2 weeks in Honolulu.
All of you who always ignore the airplane safety rules about putting on your mask before you help others, let that be a lesson to you.
Let it be a lesson, absolutely.
Speaking of that, I always smile when I'm on my many flights back and forth from Chicago to the East Coast, and they go over that, you know, if it drops down, but then put your mask on first, then help others. The reality is, if the cabin suddenly depressurized, you have literally seconds before you would probably lose consciousness. So I often wonder how for show rather than reality.
Smarter Every Day, which is one of my favorite little online YouTube series, he actually put himself, the host of this, he's also an engineer, he took his oxygen mask off in a simulated depressurization, and it was scary. You know, he faded out, and the manager of the sim was actually saying over the mic, hey, you may want to put your mask on now because you don't want to die. And he would kind of look at the sim manager kind of slanted-eyed and said, well, I guess I don't want to die. You know, the stages of consciousness, you know, you don't just pass out. You actually come to a point where your decision-making is severely impaired. And this is the stage that you don't want to get to, because then you will die simply because you don't know what to do.
Okay, short-term exposure to high levels of hydrazine. The problems include irritation of the eyes, nose, and throat, dizziness, headache, nausea, pulmonary edema, seizures, and coma.
If you recall from our little misadventure on the Martian surface, that, you know, Helmet actually was seizing from exposure to hydrazine. He also had skin irritation from it, and because of Pat's suit leak, she may have in fact had some symptoms, you know, with her not feeling well that may have compounded the hypoxia from the suit leak. So that was written into the script.
This kind of stuff, I mean, if it's spilled on your suit and then you remove your helmet in a pressurized environment, just the stuff that's on your suit, that can have effects on you just from breathing whatever's coming off of that.
Yeah, I mean, if we actually had run this live, you know, we could have made it even more dramatic with, you know, crew members coming into the hab and that they had hydrazine on them, and then that suddenly contaminates the hab. And we sort of alluded to that in the writing about hab contamination, but, you know, for the sake of the drama and making this a little difficult to visualize.
If we had done it live, there would have been a whole other set of drama.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Now, Gary, you were on the mission control end of things. What can you tell us about what it's like to try and communicate these sorts of medical emergencies. Have you had any experience in that role or witnessed it?
No real life experience, but I know the time delays are the big thing that causes the issues with the describing the medical emergencies and relaying all that information. So what I remember when we did the sim, as we were crafting the messages that we wanted to send back sort of to mission control from the mission cast that were in the separate room, we had to make sure that we listed all the things we wanted to say beforehand so we could read it out on that script. Even if you're just giving a report, you want to sort of make sure you've covered everything in that one burst of transmission. You can't have a conversation when you have that time delay. And that's the big challenge, I think, in all of this when it comes to the Mars Sim emergency simulation.
Let's talk about everybody's favorite character, Bill. I was really happy to see him die. It was just
overjoyed.
I really was. But I know we gave him almost a total recall kind of death, where just the complete vacuum sucks him out. Is this something that could actually happen? You know, would you even hear a scream from Bill, ignoring Helmut's casual murder of him?
He remembers nothing.
Right? And also...
I want to say, just for a second, because, you know, I know, you know, this was amateur acting and all this kind of fun stuff, but honestly and truly, the lines that were written for Helmut right there when Bill was just forcefully thrown out of that habit. I mean, those were beautiful, beautiful lines. And I don't know, actually, Eleanor, if you intended them to be that way, or if you actually wanted Helmut to kind of be out of it.
I basically, what I was trying to imply was, when...
He leaned on it by accident, or...
No, it was purposeful, because remember, when he woke up, he was really irritated that Bill had put the other crew members in danger. So yeah, it was, he ultimately really wanted revenge, and he never liked Bill anyway. But then he feigned, I don't know what happened. I was on drugs.
Yeah, I don't know. What? Where are you? No, I think, and it was such a joy to play that last bit, because I think, Josh, you're absolutely right. We hated Bill so much. And he was the perfect, like, god-awful, antagonist to have in the middle of all this chaos.
So let's talk a little bit about both his actual death and his mental health. I know when we've spoken before, Tom, that you certainly have expressed some frustration with either how quickly Bill succumbed to space madness or the idea that someone with his mental deficiencies would be able to make it to a mission in the first place.
Yeah, it's a battle inside me that, I like things to get all the technical facts right, yet I acknowledge that you need to take some license. I would hope that the screening process for somebody going to Mars would be tough enough that somebody like Bill would not go. But if that had happened, we wouldn't have much of a story.
I was going to tell you about a person that actually went on a simulation through the Mars Society, a scientist with no background with problems, who had a mini breakdown because his experiment did not go as planned. And for him, his career was on the line, and there was serious discussion of evacuating him out of the situation. So even with the best training in town, and even with super bright people, there's no guarantee that someone's not going to have a problem unforeseen and snap. And this guy did, to the point where people were worried about him carrying kitchen knives around. So,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
You just don't know. You just don't know.
The only civilian, that I know of who went, well, I know there's been like one other civilian after Christy McAuliffe, right? I mean, more recently.
Oh
right?
no, there have been
When
several
space-
paid space tourists.
That female astronaut that drove all the way down because she had a problem with one of co-workers and had a thing for one of the other astronauts, if you remember. This is somebody who had over $1 million worth of military and government training, and who knew that she was going to do this? So you don't always know.
Yeah.
So do any of you know what's in place currently in terms of mental health evaluation and or treatment for those in space?
I can take a bit of a crack at that. What's done now has certainly, in the U.S. program, has definitely evolved quite substantially since we started getting more long-duration experience going back into the mid-90s with the Mir space station when we had a astronaut visiting Mir. Before that, a lot of the experience with long-duration flight psychology really was in the realm of the Russians. They were the ones that had most of this, and they actually had system down pretty well with a team of psychologists and so forth that would closely monitor the cosmonauts, including even such things, interestingly, as listening to the tone of their transmissions. And if they they sensed something in the tone, a change in tone, that may prompt more, verbal intervention from the psychologists on the ground. I think the U.S. has taken a lot of lessons from that because on the Mir experience, which was pretty dramatically depicted in the book Dragonfly, the U.S. astronauts were really not prepared for that. The isolation that they felt, the fact there wasn't a lot of recreational stuff on the Mir, there were just a number of things that really challenged them. And, there's pretty clear documentation of a lot of strife between mission control and the astronauts. One of the astronauts, John Blaha, pretty famously developed clinical depression because he felt overwhelmed with the amount of work that he was being asked to do and little sympathy from mission control. But, I think those lessons have been learned to a degree with the International Space Station. And now I think the psychological screening and priming for missions occurs literally, I think, a year or 2 years before astronauts actually launch to the station. It may involve family counseling, and there's a much more sophisticated infrastructure for supporting the astronauts psychologically. So at least I think we've learned our lessons for that. But I think it's going to be a whole mag of difference if and when we actually travel to the asteroids or to Mars.
Now, I know that some of the initial, I guess I'll say, friction between flight docs and the astronauts was because of the initial fighter pilot pedigree of our astronauts, and basically the only thing a flight doc could do was ground you.
That's right. Right.
Go to your room.
Yeah. That was very famously written in Tom Wolfe's The Right Stuff, talking about that strife between the flight surgeons and the astronauts.
As the missions got more difficult, not through particularly technical challenges, but things like boredom and things like that, the whole concept changed, and it looks like it's going, it's moving in the right direction.
One of the things I know brought a question mark to both Santhosh and I was the fact that when Rick went out to retrieve Bill near the end of the drama, he brought along his gun. And I was unaware that astronauts routinely carried guns. So I was hoping one of you could comment on that.
They do carry guns. Initially, the excuse was from the Russians because they land in the Siberian Arctic areas that if they had to wait for a retrieval, that they would have something to fight off wolves and bears. That was the original excuse.
So yeah, they would have the Russians in particular are the instigators of a lot of this weaponry. So yeah, it was supposedly for a practical purpose to fend off the wolves and bears if necessary, and those included rifles as well as handguns of various types. In the U.S. program, actually, it's a little more mundane. The astronauts as early as Project Mercury had like Swiss Army knives or a knife. I believe in Gemini, they actually carried sort of a modified machete, believe it or not, because if the astronauts landed off course because they were splashing down in the Pacific, if they ended up off course and had to get marooned on an island, they wanted to be able to hack through the jungle. So they had these machetes. I've even seen pictures of the Russians having meat cleavers on board the space stations to slice up sausage, which is a little disturbing. And then
What are they making sausage out of?
I don't know. Who knows? And then the final thing that's really intriguing is apparently the Russians had literally like phaser or laser guns that I guess were potentially used for disabling, I don't know, satellites, vicious satellites or something like that. But yeah, they actually had these crazy guns that looked like, I mean, they really looked like the sci-fi stun gun that you would see.
Oh, you're talking about the ones on the stations. They're actually, there was they had a Gatling gun on one as well. It was only ever fired once when the station was unmanned. This was back in the crazy days of the Cold War.
Yeah. Yeah, that Gatling gun was pretty badass.
I'm sorry, did you just both tell me there was a Gatling gun on a space station?
Yes. Yes.
And it was fired once?
It was fired once. They had trouble aiming it because of the orbital dynamics of firing a bullet in space.
What were they aiming it at?
It was just a test. They didn't even know if it would work. The idea was if they wanted to take out one of our satellites, they would aim it at that.
Oh, so we'd fire a Gatling gun at a satellite?
Yes.
Did it work?
The gun fired. I don't have any more details other than that, but it never. They never
classified.
Yeah, no, it's Russian. It's it's all right.
Yeah, that is true. There was a Gatling gun as well as these like photon torpedo laser. These laser guns that they had on board.
Let me drift back to Linda for a moment. You are an actual nurse, and again, you mentioned specialize in kidney. How closely did our medical procedures in the HAB mirror what would likely be to happen in terms of both supplies available and the kind of medical expertise both on the HAB and in communication with ground control?
Actually, Eleanor and I have worked on this for many years, and so unfortunately it is pretty close to what would really happen. They don't carry everything, they can't carry everything, and you can't anticipate everything that could happen. So it's common, or would be not a surprise, to find out that you have a condition, but you forgot to pack that specialized medication for that particular problem. What they do is they try to decide on what the most likely things to happen, and that's what they stock. But if you're unlucky enough to come up with something unusual or unexpected, could you be there without equipment? Absolutely.
So all the improvisation we saw taking place is accurate to what would be going on?
Well, they take an inventory of what do you have, and then try to figure out what they could use out of that group. Very similar to the Apollo 13 problem. They couldn't anticipate that. They had to work with what was there. They took a couple astronauts, put them in a room, and said, this is what the guys have got on the table. You got to make, a scrubber out of a sock and a cardboard box and some tape, and, God knows, duct tape, helps a lot. So the guys had to work the problem, and in medicine we would be doing the same. What do we have up there? How can we use it? Can we use a drug differently than normal? Would it help? I don't know. They take an inventory and work the problem.
So how closely do, I guess to all of you who are with various space agencies, how closely are you working with your country's space program?
My company is what's known as a federally funded research and development corporation. Back when the Air Force was first getting missiles built, they'd choose a winner for a contract, and they wanted an independent source of how the contract was going, and they could either hire the company that won the contract, where they'd say, everything's going great, or they'd hire the company who lost the contract, and they'd say, these guys are messing up, they're doing everything wrong. So they founded my company, and the goal of our company is to be the objective source of technical knowledge, so that we can't bid on contracts. There's a specific type of job that the Air Force, in our case, says only my company can do it. And I'm not going to identify the name of my company just to...
Sure, but you would be told something like, your company is now responsible for figuring out how to build the best habitat for Mars. And that's it. You're the only ones who could do it. That kind of thing?
That kind of thing. Day to day, it's usually a little more technical. Like, this spacecraft's batteries aren't functioning the way we expect. Could you guys tell us how to run them better?
Gary, what is the Canadian Space Agency? How are you hooked into your country's space program?
So I'm with the Canadian Space Society. The Canadian Space Agency is the government-run program, similar to what we think of when we say NASA is the same government-like structure. But in the Space Society, a space advocacy organization, so we're a nonprofit, and we have local chapters where members of the public can come and hear some talks. We publish a newsletter to keep people who are members up to date on national and international space programs and space business. We also hold annual conferences. We often do also, when the Canadian Space Agency does conferences, to look further ahead to developing their own space policies. We send representatives to those conferences as well. A lot of our members are former engineers, Air Force members. So ours is much more public focused and space advocacy and space interest oriented.
And then Eleanor, you and Linda are both from Space Medicine Associates. And how are you hooked into the space world?
Well, I would say that
Space world. Sorry.
I would go there.
Yeah.
I would say back when the shuttle was still operational, we had a little more active involvement from a consultative capacity with NASA. Both Linda and I had participated in some workshops and so forth down at Johnson Space Center. I think now it's, that activity has slowed somewhat.
They'll call if they have a particular question. I did get a phone call a ways back. They wanted to know about wound care. A lot of physicians order wound care, but they don't particularly perform it, so they wanted to know what should we pack, what should we take. And I made for them a list of the type of things I would imagine would be the most efficient and, what they could think about packing. One of the things was burn net, because it's expandable, it's reusable, it's a very universal item. So there were a few things that, they'll call if they have a particular question, but, you may not hear from them for quite a while, and then all of a sudden, someone will call and have a question.
If it was you up in our story, what would you have liked to have done, or what would you have done differently if we were not forcing you down our predetermined dramatic path?
Does anyone have a particular love or interest or
favorite moment, something that just really bugged you aside from Bill going space crazy?
I was going to say maybe taking care of Bill earlier. Maybe.
Not even trying to rescue him.
Wow, Machiavellian.
As it turned out, it would have been for the greater good. I mean, there wasn't enough.
True. He was just going to die anyway.
Actually, to that point, the first time I participated in that first sim that kind of got me really interested, part of that sim included the fact that there was a solar storm. And there were two astronauts that were on the lunar surface, and one had gotten injured, and they were concerned about getting they were walking back, and would they get back in time before the major solar storm hit? So there was a lot of discussion about exposure to radiation, and at one point would it be futile to rescue them at the expense of the crew. And I actually was sitting on the radiation team, and I was like the only person arguing that they needed to let the one person that was injured go and just let him fry on the lunar surface, because you had to save the rest of the crew. It didn't make sense to sacrifice another person to go out and rescue him, because that person would be exposed to a massive amount of particle radiation. But I remember the guy that was sort of the mission control advisor for our radiation team was like appalled that I had such a horrible outlook on that. We have to try to save everybody. I'm like, no, you don't.
Why do you
Why? This isn't a Kobayashi Maru. You can let him die.
Exactly.
No. And, it's interesting that you brought up Star Trek, because that's it's one of the first things that I actually thought of just now was, depending on which Star Trek you go with, you either have Spock or Kirk stuck back there in the pod with the radiation, and he dies, and Kirk, you will always be my friend, or Spock, you will always be my friend, depending on who's who. And that's it, so long. Sorry, buddy.
That's right, and we didn't have triple blood to save Kirk.
We did not have triple blood.
If you could figure out how to rescue the person, without endangering others, then fine. But if you can't, then you can't be, thinking about that. I mean, it's such an extreme condition, such an extreme circumstance. I just don't see, why you would, do that. I mean, it is one thing if you think you can, but once conditions get, really difficult. I mean, I actually personally would have liked to have seen the storm actually hit. Like, I think I was really interested in, what would a Martian sandstorm be like?
Right.
It'd be a lot more complicated than my poor little sound Foley lab could handle.
Yeah, I know. Well, I was like a little disappointed that the storm was over, or that.
Well, I was actually in writing about the sandstorm. Initially, I wanted to have it as like this raging, tsunami, but I was reading The Martian at the time, and of course that was, one of the incipient events that sort of set everything in motion. But then, of course, after I read The Martian, and I start reading, of course, all the scientific criticisms.
Yeah, the planetary sciences and
Yeah, like it really would not have, the Martian atmosphere actually probably wouldn't support a tsunami for a dust storm, although you could get a dust storm that would, certainly obscure visibility pretty significantly. But yeah, so I opted not to have a crazy tsunami. Yeah.
Okay.
And the funny thing is, in the later dust storm that's in the book of the Martian, they actually handle it right. The sun just gets clouded more and more, and he doesn't even realize it until his batteries aren't charging right.
Right.
Exactly. That was like the best, towards the end.
Now, not a friend, but somebody I know online, he wrote a book called Safe is Not an Option, how an obsessive focus on safety is killing the space program. Because everybody's always saying, well, first off, we're going to keep everybody safe. Well, the best way to keep everybody safe is to not send them.
Right.
And the poor rover is thinking, man.
Oh, man. Snap.
Well, the public was more forgiving years ago. There were a lot of explosions, rockets that blew up. Right before the guys flew, several craft blew up, and, they used to joke that they were being put on top of a bomb. But, the public was more tolerant of that. Now you have a problem, and, they cancel your program.
Yep, that's it. It's over.
Well, and also back then, it was seen as a front in the Cold War. That was a forcing function as well. That it was actually, it was something seen as important by a large percentage of people, and that's it's debatable, but it's less so now.
Well, we certainly brought up the option of a reality show component, which I think would find a lot more people willing to take risks for their 15 minutes, bill notwithstanding. Who would be on your ideal crew? You're going on a mission to Mars. What specialists from any field at all are you taking with you?
I'm taking helmet.
Yeah.
You need a German.
You need a generalist, not a specialist. I would bring no specialist. You want a generalist because you have to be well-versed in many things, because you're going to have to be in many places with many complicated stuff. And you can always call home for the specialist discussion within reason. So for the medical physician, you want a generalist. You want family practice.
Oh, wow. I never thought of it that way. That's really brilliant, actually.
Yeah, I talked to a dentist one time, talking to him about this sort of thing, and he said, yeah, a regular doctor could do most dental work. Just need a little bit of practice on filling a couple fillings and getting some of the more likely things that you'd see. But yeah, you don't need a dentist.
Well, I think, if you look at I think that's probably true, like with the Antarctic program. Isn't it that a lot of the physicians that go down there are like generalists?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because one day you're going to suture, and the next day you may have to pull a tooth, and the next day you got to look in their eyes, and then, oh my God, the belly hurts. Well, that's a whole nother problem. So you've got to be able to do it all.
I'm sorry, I can only address heart issues.
You're not valuable, Sonny.
Actually, a way that I was toying with to get crews, the best crews together, was to take a group of talented generalists and put them together and say, here are the skills we need. Form yourselves into teams so that you had people naturally gravitate to each other who could work together, and that would form your team. You say we need a group of 5 people. You guess, just get as many of these skills as you can, then train them on the few that they're missing, and there's your crew.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I like that.
Good idea.
Does that hold for engineers? Like specific, like would you just have like a general, like a mechanical engineer?
You want the miracle worker who can be a mechanical engineer today and an electrical engineer tomorrow and a IT guy in 5 minutes, and you want the guy that can repair stuff, and he may or may not have a bunch of degrees, but if, like the German team, one of the most valuable guys on the German team was a young kid who could fix and make anything. And he didn't have a college degree, but they would not leave him behind. They brought him out. He was the most valuable guy.
So let's reframe the question then a little bit. Each of you can bring on your team, we'll assume it has a nice mix of generalists, you can bring one movie character as part of your team. So for example, I'd take Bruce Willis from Armageddon. But
all right.
you've got one person from any film or television show that can be part of your team from any field who you think would contribute.
Oh, so not just medicine, but
one character from any film or television show who is going to be on that Mars mission with you, and you think they have that good general range of abilities. Who are you all taking?
Okay, this is Tom, and it's completely cliche, but I'm going to say MacGyver with a little more control, just a little more focus on some of the long-term thought.
I was going to say Mark Watney, because I thought it was very clever how they wove the story. They had botany, but he also had an engineering background. Half the stuff that he had to do was jerry-rig stuff or readapt things.
I was absolutely thinking of Hawkeye, and then I was going through all my MASH characters and thinking, okay, well, if not Hawkeye, who?
Radar.
Well, then clearly it'd be Hot Lips.
Radar. You need a person in the crew that can keep everybody even keel. So usually when you have a group, there's 1 or 2 people that when you put them in the mix, they just kind of keep everybody blended, everybody working together. They smooth out the rough edges when people get edgy. So you need that person as well, because you've been talking about engineers and fix-it kind of people, but you also need the mental people fix-it kind of person. So you need multiple personalities present in a good combination, which if we throw back to Star Trek, there was always 3 of them. We had the country doctor, who was the emotional guy. We had the scientist, which was Spock, and then we had, the warrior type, when the 3 of them were always together, and they couldn't do it separately. They had to always do it together.
Right. I remember in, like a season of House, which is one of my all-time favorites to always reference, but they had House on there, and you were talking about, you got to have Cuddy. She said, I want someone who can be not just thinking about black and white. I want someone on board who can genuinely understand the in-betweens, the shades of gray.
I was waiting for that.
Fine, there, you happy, fine. Okay, good.
And what about you, Gary? Who would you bring along?
I think what you need is someone in a leadership role that can keep people calm in a crisis and really approach decision-making in sort of a rational manner. So you'd want someone with some background, an astronaut with some previous history, like, say, on the space station where they've had some crises perhaps before, like a fire or something. And the character that I sort of immediately thought of and kept coming back to was the Tom Hanks character from Apollo 13, someone who provided that leadership at a time of crisis
Yeah, I agree. I was thinking absolutely gym level.
Gym level. Yep.
Level. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Which kind of brings up why at the end of the sim, when Pat looks over and goes, "Oh my God," what is this? And you go, "Why didn't you get all excited?" Because astronauts would not scream.
Right. Oh yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
That's
Oh, my.
exactly how they respond. They don't respond screaming and running from the thing. And I remember somebody asked me, why didn't you yell or something? And I said, because they really wouldn't.
Yeah. The years and years of training that they undergo, just even at the edge of crisis where you're really starting to lose it because of fear and panic, that you still take a breath and say something other than "Oh my God!" Probably even that was a little over the top for that kind.
I know, but I was yelling at all of you at every step along the way to emote.
Yeah,
emote. Yeah, be enthusiastic. And you're like, no, astronauts wouldn't do that. We'd just be like, oh, he ran off. Bummer. More work.
Well, think of Apollo 13. The guys are thinking that they're probably dead, and the guy just calls up on the phone and says, "Houston, we have a problem."
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And
We're in a spot of bother over here.
We
exactly
see
it.
too. What?
That's what made that scene and that line so memorable, and it still resonates because it was the understatement of the year, but it was what we do hope that we will be and what we will do in a crisis.
Yes.
Right.
Remember, the rescue of the Miracle on the Hudson was mostly uncoordinated. They were people with boats, and there were nearby ferries and stuff like that. They were just pulling people off that plane. They happened to be on duty in the Hudson, and they just went for the plane. Yep.
Poor Tom Hanks should just stop working. Like, he's always playing these people who get forced to make terrible decisions.
I'm very excited for that movie. I can't wait to see what they do with it.
Oh, I know.
Yeah, agreed.
That's all sort of the medical aspects. What about, is there anything technical that, we as the audience should know? Because certainly this was my first experience with anything as cosmologically related as a space mission.
Well, there's a lot of things we left out. The soil outgasses CO2. It's there's a lot of things that we didn't add in. There wasn't time for, and in honesty, there's a lot of things we don't know. We don't know a lot about Martian soil and what it can do or not do, or the radiation and how it comes in and out, and what the weather really is. You got to go live there. I mean, we can talk about deserts, but until you live in one, you don't really appreciate. So, you have to kind of see, and there's an awful lot of stuff we don't know.
Right.
We just don't. Time clock, circadian rhythm. Mars has a similar day, but not an exact day. How does that affect, the body? We're synced with Earth. How long would it take us to sync to a different planet? Mars is pretty close, but, you go out a little farther, and, some of the days, the seasons are really different. And how would that biologically change us? I mean, we just don't know.
And one of the other things I actually remembered I wanted to ask about is all of these things that we had take place in the radio drama, even though the story itself was released over several months, really took place within the first couple days of landing on the surface. Is this the kind of problems, if you can... Does everything crash down immediately in terms of catastrophes, or was this unrealistic?
Catastrophes tend not to come singly, just so you know that. And there's a classic one that unfortunately comes from war, but it basically says, your plans are over on day one.
Right. Yeah.
Because from that point forward, you have no idea, and you have to adapt on a minute-by-minute basis going forward. So you might have the best plan in the world, but the weather could not work for you. Something doesn't arrive, something doesn't get there. I mean, it all changes the minute you start on day one.
Sure,
Yeah,
sure.
And as soon as the adrenaline starts pumping, most people have trouble making good decisions.
Realistically, the emergencies, if they were to happen because of carelessness or mistakes, they're likely to happen later in the mission because people are getting complacent. There may be some fatigue built in. And so I think you would be part of the leadership of the mission would be focused on keeping everyone on their game and treating everything sort of like it's new and just keeping in the game and making sure they're being safe.
Yeah, in this case, the trigger to the whole thing was a bad harness that they were using on the hydrazine tank. So, we couldn't be blamed on any one person in particular, or a lot of the other factors. It was purely a mechanical failure that drove the rest of it.
It's scary to think about how much is in your control and how much is out of your control, and from that point on, how you can react or what you can do.
All this took place over the course of maybe a day or two. Is there a window where if you can make it past that first period, disasters are less likely to occur? I'm sure there's some statistical actuary out there figuring it out.
Well, I don't know, I wouldn't be surprised if NASA is probably doing this type of modeling now, but I know that there was a lot of work done during the shuttle and space station years, at least from a medical standpoint, in modeling what are the most likely medical events to occur, when they would occur, their severity. So they certainly have done that over the years and have a pretty fair estimation of the types of events that would occur. I think they're only starting to consider those types of things for long-duration flight or planetary settlement, but I'm sure that they're planning that. So
what are the most common medical issues that they've expected to occur?
I think the two I would say the three issues right now, just based on what's being pretty actively researched, and you see a number of articles in the lay press about this. Long-duration transit would be number one, radiation exposure. And, immediately what comes to mind is, it's galactic cosmic rays. But actually the ones that can really do some significant harm are particle exposure. So from a massive solar flare and the particles emanating from that I think are more of a danger. Although cosmic rays, may have a cumulative danger as well over time.
Yes, they cause you to make terrible superhero movies.
You turn green, Hulk out. But radiation exposure and sufficient shielding on the spacecraft is a huge issue that I don't think we have sufficient answers for yet. So that's one salient issue.
You're talking about solar storms right there, right? So just
that's
ejected plasma just coming out, and all this atmosphere that's protecting us here on Earth isn't out there.
And the magnetic field.
And the magnetic field. So that's going to mess with instruments.
Mess with instruments and also the human instruments on your bodily
organs. Oh, sure, yeah. Which way is up anyway?
Yeah. So yeah, that's one major issue. The other issue is going to be bone loss. Over time, the longer you're in space, you have progressive loss of bone mineralization as well as muscle strength. And, we know that exercise to a degree kind of mitigates some of that, but it's still, we can't completely arrest it. Well, with one caveat. I know there's been some experimentation with a particular machine they had on space station called AREDS, I believe. They were able to actually almost completely arrest bone loss, but at the expense of a higher frequency of the eye issues, and that's the third issue that I think is very concerning. That we've discovered in the last decade or so. I think it's a fairly recently described phenomenon that astronauts in some cases are losing their visual acuity, and the longer you're in space, that seems to be more of an issue. They don't know exactly why that occurs, but some of the conditions seems to mimic some conditions that you see on Earth with increased intracranial hypertension and so forth. But no one knows the exact reason, but it is occurring with the astronauts, and obviously the big issue is, could this become such a problem that they could lose their eyesight?
Wow.
Yeah.
So you're saying pressure builds up in the brain and behind the eye because the optic nerve is contiguous with the brain, and so that pressure kind of squeezes the retina from the back.
What they've observed is that literally the eyeball is getting squashed from behind,
Right.
and that there can even be folds that can occur in the optic nerve. And
it gets kinked.
it gets kinked. And one of the predominant theories is that they have to do with the cephalic flow of fluid that occurs when you get into a weightless environment, that fluids are flowing towards the head because they're more evenly distributed in the body. But I don't think that's 100%. That's kind of NASA's big working theory.
Sure.
But I don't think that's absolutely, nailed in stone that that's exactly what's going on. A researcher at NASA is actually going to be doing some observational work with Mayo Clinic to look at patients with polycystic ovarian syndrome. Some of the clinical manifestations of PCOS in women can include increased intracranial pressure, eye changes, and some of these changes apparently can mimic what they're seeing in the astronauts.
Oh.
And PCOS is really a condition of hormonal imbalance, including testosterone.
Yes,
So,
hyperandrogenism.
Yeah, hyperandrogenism, and whether high-stress environment of being in weightlessness is inducing a hyperandrogenic state.
Oh.
And maybe that's causing problems. It's kind of it's a part of the pun out there theory. But
No. It's interesting. I was trying to think of a pun like women have more gravitas. And when gravity leaves a woman, she becomes a man. I couldn't think of a...
Yeah. Well, interestingly, the one criticism of some of this research, potential research, is that PCOS is in women. The majority of these cases that have been observed in space have been in men, but you kind of probably have a selection bias because the majority of the astronauts that have flown have been men.
Yeah.
So, but this work is apparently going to be starting, and the other great point about this guy coming up with this idea is that is a completely out of the box idea.
Yeah. That's what we need.
Completely out of the box. And
that's how most great discoveries are made.
Yeah. Just a little crazy is excellent. I just want to, so this is out in 0G and traveling between the Earth to Mars. So our intrepid crew was out on Mars, so some of this was mitigated, right? There was gravity, not as good as Earth, but there was gravity, so probably a little less bone loss. You have a thin atmosphere, so a little bit of less of a worry from solar storms and cosmic radiation. Is there one in particular, like on the surface of Mars, from health issues, either long-term or short-term, that kind of carries over from space down onto the planet that you can think of?
I'd say the dust is a big question mark.
Oh, sure. Inhaling, yes.
Dust is an issue. I think the other potential issue is the soil content has a high amount of peroxides and perchlorates, if I recall, and they're very corrosive. So I think there's been some of that's also whacked into discussions about whether you could actually grow plants on the Martian surface. But I think that's toxic exposure from the soil, I think, is certainly an issue.
Wow. Okay.
And for more information on all the medical things that can happen in space, check out our previous season's episodes with the same guests.
Yeah, all the wonderful people that you hear right now.
So one of the last things I definitely want to touch on is mission control. I know we spent a lot of time talking about our crew up on Mars and the medical things they had there, but what does it look like from the ground side, the side that most of us may actually have a decent chance of getting into if we work hard and pay attention in school?
Learn your math, kids.
For me, the best description of what's going to happen there is that what we call mission control now will move more into what's been called mission support. Because now, on board the International Space Station, if an astronaut is doing some task, there are times where they have to ask for permission to do every step. And that's just not going to happen on Mars. With a between 5 and 20-minute one-way communication, it's just not going to be that way. So So the mission control is going to have to mesh into, all right, we know they're coming up on this. What kind of information might they be needing, and can we get on the way to them? They're not always going to be right, but when they are, it'll be a big help.
It's like a semicircle with the screens that everybody's used to seeing, but what you forget is behind every seat is a whole cadre of other people and experts. So someone might be sitting at, say, the flight medicine desk, but if they come across a problem that they don't know or they need help on, there's a whole group of people behind them that they call to get even more information. And a lot of people don't realize that it's more like a central place, and then there's all these other people that are helping. And so, you know, there's a lot of positions that people never hear about that are very valuable because they're kind of behind the scenes.
I'll support that as well. The difference between, say, what happened in the movie Apollo 13, well, the real life Apollo 13, and what you might see in the sim is with the Apollo 13 case, it was really, in many cases, it was one decision-making cycle because they're in constant communication. And then when they need to break and think about problems, they break, they think about problems, and they come back, and it's sort of one cycle. When you have communications that are separated by 20-minute or 40-minute relay time, you will have two decision-making cycles. The astronauts will be working their own cycle independent of what mission control is doing, and there'll be potential there for conflict when you'll have, say, the mission control back on Earth maybe start second-guessing or suggesting things or ordering things that the crew on Mars have already considered and rejected because of their own decision-making cycle. So I think there is some potential for conflict there.
I think that is a pretty good debrief of both our show and another fascinating glimpse into the world of space medicine. So thank all of you for your help and participation both in the story and just for being such interesting folks.
Yeah, you guys totally rock. Thank you so much for everything you taught us.
And that concludes this special episode. Thanks to all our various representatives, Gary from the Canadian Space Society, Lynn, Linda, Thomas from the National Space Society, Eleanor, and of course Linda from the Space Medicine Associates, and all of you, our fantastic listeners. Hope your time listening to this episode was out of this world.
Ooh. No, that was the wrong sound. That was the wrong sound. Oh, damn it was the wrong sound.
Space Ghost, coast to coast. All right, folks, so that brings it to an end. As always, our theme music is composed by Rachel Leisure. We love to hear your comments, concerns, questions, and feedback. You can find us on Facebook, on Twitter, on Squarespace, and please leave us ratings and reviews on iTunes or wherever you download your podcasts. Thank you so much for joining us, and as always, until next time, happy travels.
Happy travels. Bye, guys.